Good morning, everyone here in Australia, and good evening or good afternoon, wherever you are around the world. My name is Lydia Khalil. I'm the AVERT coordinator, and we're really pleased today to welcome Dr. Matt Levitt, who is the former Wexler Fellow, and director of the Reinhardt Program of Counterterrorism and Intelligence at the Washington Institute. Dr. Levitt has formerly served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the U.S. Department of Treasury, and before that as an FBI counterterrorism analyst. He teaches at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and is the author of the Washington Institute's recent Rethinking U.S. Efforts on Counterterrorism Toward a Sustainable Plan 2 Decades After 9/11. And that's what he's going to be here talking to us today. Dr. Levitt, welcome. Thank you very much. We really look forward to your presentation. I'm going to kick it off to you very shortly, but before we do, just a few housekeeping notes. If you do have any questions as you go along, please, we encourage you to put them in the Q&A chat, and which we'll refer back to at the end of Matt's remarks, where we can present them to him and have a discussion going forward. I believe everyone should already be on mute. And we also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we all meet. We're all online, so meeting in different areas around Australia as well too. So Dr. Levitt, over to you. Thank you so much.
Lydia, thank you so much for the invitation. Michelle, thank you so much for bringing this group together. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts with you about how the US government is trying to rethink and refashion its counterterrorism posture, and the ways in which that is going to be impactful for our closest allies, including, of course, Australia. My final assignment at the FBI many years ago was leading the analytical team for Flight 175 after 9/11, what the FBI called Pent Bomb, which was the operational name for the investigation into September 11th. We had flight teams for each of the 4 flights. We had teams for other issues, including some threats that we feared were happening, most of which didn't or were thwarted. But the main 4 teams were the flight teams, and there was an operational team and an analytical team for each. So it really is kind of jarring for me 20 years later to be thinking about what we've done well, and we have done some things really well, and what we've done wrong, and we have done some things really wrong. And to take a step back as an academic now and think about, why we are having this big idea right now of rethinking our counterterrorism posture, making it kind of more sustainable, rationalizing it, what the big idea behind it is, and then a little bit of how we're going to go about doing that. And I'd like to try and leave as much time for Q&A and conversation. So here we go. You're all very much aware, I'm sure, that there's very little bipartisan consensus on just about anything here in the United States nowadays, and it's been that way for the better part of 3 administrations, certainly 2. And therefore, it's really telling when you have an issue where there is significant bipartisan consensus, and whereas people may come at this issue from different perspectives, there is significant bipartisan consensus on the need to curtail the size of our international deployments. I don't like the terms endless wars or forever wars, because many people tend to lump any foreign deployment into those, though to his credit, President Biden has explicitly not. Has made a distinction between small deployments and very large, very long deployments. But the fact that there is this bipartisan consensus means that this is something that can actually happen and is actually happening. The big change happened under the Trump administration, where you had 3 different national security strategies. There were more, but 3 that were relevant. The National Defense Strategy, the National Security Strategy, and the National Counterterrorism Strategy. Of those 3, the most critically important is the National Defense Strategy, because that drives the Pentagon. And you may not be aware, somewhere around 80% of the US intelligence community resides in the Defense Department. So where the DoD goes, the tail follows. And we had a significant shift already then, but you didn't see a parallel shift even in the other national security strategies, the national security strategy itself, the national counterterrorism strategy. And so it created this tension over the last 2 years of the Trump administration, where strategic planners within the National Counterterrorism Center, within the DoD, and other parts of the US national security bureaucracy, really trying to figure out how to put this square peg through this round hole. The idea here, though, is something that has really seeped into the bureaucracy across the aisle here. The case for rationalizing the US counterterrorism mission to make it more sustainable is really actually pretty basic. We need to be able to deal with multiple national security threats at once, not only counterterrorism. Already during the Obama administration, people started talking about wanting to shift things so that we didn't look at every problem through counterterrorism tinted glasses. But that's very, very hard to do when there are threats after threats after threats. Politically, it's very, very hard to try and shift the way you're doing counterterrorism, because one thing gets through the cracks, and politically, it's a tremendous mess. But we have all kinds of threats nowadays. We have great power competition on the rise again. We have near power competition. We have the environment. We have global pandemics. And these are new national security threats in the sense that we're treating them newly as national security threats. You just had the former head of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency here in the United States, pen an op-ed in the Washington Post arguing that the US intelligence community really needs to take the ball and be the leading agency for forecasting on global pandemics. Their reality is that this has been tremendously costly to the United States, this counterterrorism posture, which is mostly the military, but not only the military posture. And at a time of shrinking budgets, at a time of soaring deficits, there's an urgent need to figure out where are we going to get money to deal with the global pandemic, to deal with the economic fallout of the global pandemic, to deal with immigration issues, or any of the other huge things that are going on nowadays. The crux of the problem is figuring out a way to shift, to change, to take a step back and reassess, how do we do counterterrorism differently? What continues, what changes, in such a way so as not to lose the gains of the past 20 years, to not lose the gains of 20 years of counterterrorism investments. And I think it's important to note here that we have to be prepared. Our adversaries have a say, right? We planned to leave Afghanistan in a particular way, and IS Khorasan, ISK, had other ideas. So how do you go about doing this in such a way that you don't lose the advantages of the past 20 years? This one slice of the puzzle has become very front and center in the wake of the Afghanistan withdrawal. Simply explained, we have become very, very reliant over 20 years on being able to get regular flows of certain types, certain quality, and certainly a particular type of quantity of intelligence out of Afghanistan. And we're not dark, but we're pretty dark gray in terms of what we will be able to collect. That's a problem. And I'll explain why that's even more of a problem as we get into the big idea. But before I do, I think it's important to mention that, when we take this look back 20 years after 9/11, I think it's very important to realize there's some things we did really well, some things we did not so poorly. There's lots of ways to break that down. I make it really simple. If you think about counterterrorism as tactical counterterrorism, stopping the next attack, following the blue van that the chatter tells you is driving around New York City, more than once in my life, that was my 24/7 literally following, tracking a blue van in New York City. And strategic counterterrorism, getting ahead of the problem, making it so that there aren't as many people who are willing to or believe that the best way to achieve their political, social, religious, cultural goals are through violence targeting civilians. If you look at those two things, that to me is the breakdown of what we've done well and what we haven't. We've certainly made mistakes even in tactical counterterrorism too, don't get me wrong. But basically, we've gotten really good at finding, fixing, and finishing, to use the US military's jargon, preventing the next attack. There's no such thing as 100%, but we've gotten pretty good at that. Where we have faced abject failure is in draining the pool of potential recruits. The US list of known and suspected terrorists is 20 times as large today as it was at 9/11. There are many more terrorists. There are many more extremists, if you want to broaden it out more, today than there were 20 years ago. They are in more places and they are dispersed. They probably aren't as capable of carrying out a 9/11 type spectacular attack, though they've tried many different ways and times, including a very serious aviation plot involving Australia. But they are in more places and more of them and more types of small attacks. Strategically, we have not been successful. So from the US perspective, what's the big idea in our changing of the posture? It's this. After 9/11, we went to the world and we said, listen, we will lead, we want you to participate. And what we envision are US-led and partner-enabled missions. And the US is now saying, we can't be everywhere all the time. So we are going to focus on the homeland and on threats to US interests abroad. When those things happen, we'll be front and center. But anything else, including with the big names like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, if they're closer to you, you take lead in dealing with it and let us know how we can partner. So flipping on its head the US-led partner-enabled model to one that is partner-led, US-enabled. There's a little bit of an irony. Doing that is going to require greater intelligence, more timely, more actionable intelligence, because it's going to be relying on forecasting, on being able to look ahead. And we're demanding that of our intelligence community at a time when we are pulling back, and therefore our ability to run sources on the ground, put drones up and down really fast. We're going to have to rework how we do the intelligence at the very time that we're going to be asked to rely even more on the intelligence community. Part of this is understanding that counterterrorism is a serious threat. It has never been, and it will never be an existential threat to the United States. I would argue that probably in most cases, if not every case, counterterrorism is not an existential threat. I would argue that even in the case of, say, like Israel, terrorism is not an existential threat. An Iran nuclear device, maybe, right? But Hamas, Hezbollah, very dangerous, very serious, not existential. Great power competition presents a much bigger type of threat in certain types of ways. And at a time when we're dealing with a global pandemic where 3,000 people are dying regularly, so 9/11 was horrific. We had 3,000 people killed in one day. This is happening on a regular basis now. There's a different scale that we're dealing with. At the end of the day, we're going to have to do this in such a way that we're able to deal with counterterrorism and great power competition at the same time. In fact, we're going to have to find ways to deal with them, not only make sure we're not treating them as mutually exclusive, but specifically focusing at the Venn diagram overlap. So for example, in the Trump administration, in an effort to shift from counterterrorism to great power competition, President Trump decided that he was going to significantly slash manpower and resources for AFRICOM, US Command in Africa. But AFRICOM is tiny. It was saving very little amount of money. Africa is an area of tremendous great power competition, and it's an area where the currency, as is the case in many places in the world, the currency that we have that is most valuable to those countries is in counterterrorism support. And we can leverage that towards great power competition benefit as well. How we focus on that Venn diagram is something that's going to define the next 5 to 10 years, certainly here in the United States, but I'd argue overall. And I think that the flare-up between the US and Australia in particular, and France over the submarine deal is an example of how we are learning slowly, awkwardly, not so smoothly, to navigate that. So how do we go about doing that, right? So we know why we're making the case for rationalizing the U.S. counterterrorism posture. We get a sense of what the big idea is, right? Shifting from U.S.-led partner-enabled to partner-led U.S.-enabled. But how do we go about doing that? What needs to be done to make that possible? There are a few things we need to do. The first thing we need to do is we need to rebuild U.S. credibility as a reliable counterterrorism partner. I believe that U.S. credibility as a counterterrorism partner, as a reliable long-term counterterrorism partner, has been eroded over the past few years, whether it was Obama's red line or any number of things involving President Trump, including his multiple decisions to wake up in the morning and tweet that we're out of Syria. Europe, if you don't take back your nationals, we're just going to close down the camps and throw them in your direction. I was in a European capital walking into an intelligence agency for a meeting that December when President Trump first announced, woke up and said, hey, we're out of Syria. It was a catastrophe. And our very close ally that was deployed there with us was completely caught off guard and already asking, how do I plug into a system with the United States? We just don't know what's going to happen come tomorrow morning. Again, Afghanistan matters here. If I am the Kurds in Iraq, if I am the SDF in Syria, pick your place on the globe, I have to be asking myself, under what circumstances do I wake up in the morning and find out that whether it's a Trump or a Biden, we're out and we're out really fast. There are some technical things we need to do. We need to disentangle our intelligence support for counterterrorism budget from our kinetic counterterrorism budgets. Basically, in a nutshell, without getting too technical, over the past 20 years, it was much more efficient, much faster to get money to the counterterrorism mission if it was scaffolded, if it was just slapped on top of the military budget. So if the warfighter needed something, it went like that. We have people on the ground in Afghanistan or Iraq. The warfighter needs something, whether it's a new Starbucks or a new weapon system. Those things we have ways to make happen really fast. It wasn't always the case. It isn't always the case that it's quite so simple for things like intelligence. But if you slapped that intelligence requirement onto saying, look, this is supporting the warfighter, it went very quickly. What this meant was you didn't have two separate budget line items. And now that you've moved the whole kinetic line item, for example, out of Afghanistan, that doesn't leave a line item for a fully funded, wholly functional intelligence collection program, running human sources, paying sources, drones, maybe drones not without missiles, but more sensors. Don't assume that those just can be left behind. There's an entire budget process. And if you ask me what's the one thing you miss least about not being in government, it's having to deal with the budget process. That's not fun. As a parallel, we're going to need to invest in modernization and innovation when it comes to our counterterrorism intelligence capabilities, artificial intelligence, machine learning. We will find ways to fill the gaps for the collection that platforms we've lost in Afghanistan, but we're dealing with a reality today where not all or even the best information is wholly classified. Tremendous amounts of extremely valuable, actionable information are somewhere on social media or elsewhere. Making sense of all that information in a timely manner, that's really, really hard. I think it's really important that the United States and our allies, but I'll just speak as an American for the United States, take a step back and realize that the Cold War has been over for a long time, and we need to stop thinking about threats as a solely binary function of victory or defeat. Especially when it comes to non-state, sub-state actors, sometimes the goal is not to win or to avoid losing, but it's to keep threats at bay. And I think, personally, if someone had asked me, I would have said we should have stayed in Afghanistan with 2,500 US troops and an equal number of NATO troops. And I would have done something like that. Personally, I think I have no problem with us redescribing what we're doing in Iraq. but I think we need to stay in Iraq. I think we desperately need to be in northern Syria. And I think the point there is not to win, not to defeat someone, but to hold threats at bay. Can we, at reasonable cost, financial cost, costs to personnel, keep threats at bay? Nobody raises any concerns about the very, very, very large US deployments that still exist today in Germany and on the Korean Peninsula. And the reason is that people aren't getting shot at every day. Well, sometimes I think we're going to need to be able to keep these threats at bay, and thinking about this as an ongoing effort that is short of both war and peace will be helpful in terms of figuring out what truly is and what isn't an endless or forever war, because we're not talking about massive deployments, but we might be talking about long periods of time. Look, we have to recognize that when it comes to the type of innovation that we saw for the kinetic fight over the past 20 years, we need a very similar parallel investment and in innovation in prevention to be able to get ahead of the problem set. And we need to ask ourselves some very, very difficult questions. I think that things like counterterrorism capacity building are going to continue to be really important. But unlike the way they've been over the past 20 years, which is to say military focused, these should be civilian counterterrorism capacity building programs, rule of law programs, prison programs, forensic investigation programs, biometrics, border security, all the things that need to be done short of actually going to war to deal with the terrorism problem. Because at the end of the day, and I get asked this all the time, I'll be testifying before Congress later this week. I'll be surprised if they don't ask it. They ask it all the time. How do we win the war on terrorism? Just another reason why the term war on terrorism was such a terrible term. There was no real war on terrorism any more than there is a war on drugs or a war on crime, at least not the one that can be won. What we're trying to do to win is to get it down to a lower level threat that can basically just be a law enforcement threat, not to end it. Terrorism is a form of human interaction at our worst, but it's going to be there. We need to invest in prevention and in civilian counterterrorism capacity building to complement the hard counterterrorism that we've learned to do pretty well, not with soft in the sense of, not strong, but soft counterterrorism in the sense of trying to get ahead of the problem. And I think that the most significant thing we can do, and with this I'll end, is recognize that while we, I'm sure, need sometimes more intelligence officers and more federal agents and more police, what we need more than anything else are clinical social workers and psychiatrists. What we need are people who are going to do counterterrorism, not because of countering terrorism, but prevention, and good prevention at its core is good governance. It's making sure that we have really healthy, functioning societies. And by society, I don't mean the country, I mean a neighborhood. So there is a tremendous amount of things we need to shift our perspective. Counterterrorism, getting ahead of the problem, is not going to be about the warfighter or even the agent or the operative as much as it's going to be investing in our societies so that people feel that there are ways to express themselves, ways to access services, to get their voices heard so that they can affect change in a way short of violence targeting civilians. That's going to be especially difficult because jihadism is still a very significant problem. Islamist extremism is a very significant problem. We have all kinds of isms, including the very, very serious problem of the extreme far right. You're much more likely to get killed by white supremacists in the United States today than by Al-Qaeda or Islamic State. All of this requires a similar type of toolkit, however, and it starts at home. So a lot of ideas, a lot of big ideas. I'm happy to get into conversation with you about all of these. I want to thank Avert for the programming you do in general and for including me in it. And with that, let me end this introduction and embark on a much more interesting and fun conversation.
Matt, thank you so much. That was fantastic and a really comprehensive overview of all of these issues that we need to take a look at. I've been scribbling notes and questions to ask you as you've gone along, but I might first start with the question posed by Levi West, which is a good one, and it gets to your broader points. You made these points about tactical successes versus strategic failures. And he asks, do you think it's possible to actually succeed in strategic counterterrorism while having to engage in frequent and ongoing tactical counterterrorism operations? So in other words, if you're constantly having to make tactical maneuvers, is there any, can that be considered in any way a strategic success?
That's a great question. And you have to answer, I think, in two different ways. One is kind of at battlefields and one is in society, right? We are fighting terrorism in places where, 75, 80, 90% of it is very kinetic. And we're also fighting terrorism, in Melbourne and Sydney and Washington, D.C. and New York and all of that. So the bottom line is we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? We have to be able to engage in the tactical things that need to be done in places where that needs to happen. But we also need to be able to engage in strategic counterterrorism where we can. So look, engaging in strategic counterterrorism in Yemen right now is going to be very, very difficult. There are lots of things that can and should be done in Yemen that I think would contribute to moving in that direction. But when things are that up in the air and difficult and kinetic, that's going to be very difficult. But that's not the situation in the vast majority of places around the world. So the real question is, what do you do with places like Libya or Tunisia or Jordan? What happens when you get away from the far ends of the spectrum where it's really obviously doable or really obviously not doable? What happens in that fat middle? That's where it gets complicated. And the reality is that it's politically very, very hard to take your foot off the gas of the tactical, because you're constantly trying to make sure nothing happens on your watch. And the nature of our democracies, certainly here in the United States in 4-year cycles, is that, if I'm a politician today, unless I'm a really, really big thinker and what's primary on my agenda is not only or primarily my reelection, then I'm not going to be focused on things that have 10, 20-year timelines. I'm going to be focused on a very clear 2.5 to 4-year timeline. But that's what leadership is. Leadership is being able to say, look, here's what we need to do to prevent the threats nowadays, the ones that are very, very current that are happening already. Here's what we need to get ahead of it. Because you look back 20 years now and you can see very, very clearly, Monday morning quarterbacking with 2020 hindsight, that failure to address the things that make people angry to the point of wanting to carry out acts of violence affects us in a big way tomorrow. And for a long time, we thought that was all ideology. And ideology plays a very, very important role in mobilizing people to actually go and do something. But people have to have, there's something going on that gives people a cognitive opening, some type of experience or grievance, typically a lot of different things that get them to that point where they're amenable to an ideology that can mobilize them. It's almost never starting with ideology.
So Matt, in the beginning of your presentation, you talked about a couple of different strategies that were driving, the overall CT kind of framework and architecture. You talk about defense strategy, national security strategy, but one of the things that kind of piques my interest that was missing, unless I missed it, was you didn't speak about the Department of Homeland Security strategy. So where does all of that fit in, in overall CT frameworks?
So you didn't hear wrong. It's just that DHS doesn't publish its own national strategy. It contributes to the national counterterrorism strategy and the national security strategy. There's debate now: what should there be a specific homeland security strategy? DHS was the biggest change, bureaucratic change to come with the advent of 9/11. And the acts of Congress that created the National Counterterrorism Center and other things. In some ways, it's been very successful. In a lot of ways, it has been, a very, very learning process. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Part of it is trying to figure out within the slice of Homeland Security that we're talking about. So not immigration and not customs and not Secret Service. DHS is the second largest US department after the DoD by far, but focusing on the stuff we're talking about, that's actually a very small slice of DHS. And it's gone through lots of different birthing pains, from the CVE task force under the Obama administration that was already being reorganized, but was then disbanded under the Trump administration, and to the ways that it's now being run, the newly renamed CP3, Center for Prevention, Partnerships and Programs, I think it is. DHS has a really important role to play here, but mostly on this community building piece of it. So they have a tremendous convening authority, and now DHS has representatives in different parts of the country, where they are basically representing the federal government and federal government dollars and capabilities to state, local, tribal elements who, in law enforcement and beyond law enforcement, who are working on these issues at a very grassroots community level. For 5 years now, I've been running a CVE working group. I realize many people no longer use the CVE term. I still do. We're actually going to be having a presentation from one of the regional directors, one of the CP3 regional directors from Middle America pretty soon. And they're in the process of kind of figuring out what kind of new ways, what new things they can do, they can bring to these local actors. To me, just the idea of it not being federally driven, but recognizing that this is a local phenomenon. This is something that's happening in neighborhoods, in communities, within families, and that the people who are going to be most there, most available, most welcomed in to participate, intervene, whatever, are going to be local people, whether it's a school teacher or a librarian or a religious figure or a family member, what have you. That's not going to be something FBI or DHS is going to be in a position to do. They have unique capabilities they can plug into these things. It's frustrating. I've been working in the CVE space for 20 years now, and this is a conversation we were having in the years right after 9/11. There was a project in Amsterdam that was kind of very, very similar to this and was very, very, very successful. And then politicians got wind of it and said, wait a minute, and got very concerned, and it was terminated. So to me, the biggest challenge we have is the reality of the politics, where politics says, I'm not going to fund things until you show me they can work. Of course, I can't show you they can work until I get some seed funding. And then it's fine, make sure that I have to have metrics and evaluation processes built into this, but I got to get some funding. The politics of our election cycles, and my responsibility is these 4 years, not the next 4 years. The politics of making sure nothing happens on my watch. All of these preclude us from doing strategic thinking, which by definition is a little bit over the horizon. And the horizon can be just 4 years.
So keeping with that, we actually have a lot of follow-up questions around CVE and CP3. Given that political context, we have a follow-up question about that in terms of how you feel its prospects for success are, and how is it different than before, from what you've seen in your career working on countering violent extremism?
So what CP3 does that's different is that it literally is trying to convene programs. And who are the local actors, if there aren't local actors helping people come together to fill these gaps. Those gaps can be community organizations that work with police and particular at-risk communities. It can be people who are working in underprivileged or underserviced neighborhoods. It can be the psychiatric community, to make sure that there are people who are willing to volunteer their time to be able to do threat evaluations. And I mean threat evaluations not in some type of big counterterrorism term, but actually in psychiatric terms. To big brother and sister. There's lots and lots and lots of different types of participants in all this. DHS has been really, really good within CP3 at trying to find, they have their own, but also marrying people up with other seed money, building in metrics and evaluations, systems to be able to measure these things, making it so people aren't reinventing the wheel all over again. Actually, someone's already tried this and we've measured that and what can be done here. Convening people together on things like threats that are presented on social media and big tech, and also ways that big tech can be made part of the solution, not by having conversations with senior Facebook executives, but by making sure that local activists and community leaders are familiar with tools that are available, and also some of the dangerous things that might be going on that, you know, people like me in their 50s might not be aware of. So, you know, to my mind, CP3 is trying to get out into the field. It's not a Washington focused thing. To the extent it is Washington focused, it's what pots of money do we have here? Who can we marry you with to get you the metrics and evaluation you need? You know, I have an idea to do something. Who's done that already? It's taken us a long time to recognize that there's not a one size fits all, right? And I think the Obama administration meant well in this direction when it came up with these 3 pilot programs in LA, Minneapolis, and Boston, recognizing that things aren't going to be the same. They're 3 very different programs, but those communities were pretty annoyed because the Obama administration, DHS at the time, came and said, hey, congratulations, you're the pilot programs. We're going to be coming back to evaluate you. You're getting no more money. You're getting no more personnel. Let us know how it goes. Like, that wasn't well received. But at least there was this recognition that, hey, what you're doing in LA may not be the same thing that you need to be doing in Minneapolis. You may be seeing different types of things in different cities, different places, and that's okay.
Yeah, having been involved with the Boston effort, I remember that well, having it just be kind of presented to us as a fait accompli, and it said, there you go, you're not getting any more help or funding, but come up with something. But as you said, there was some positive things that kind of came out of it. Let's stick with this kind of CVE angle as well, because we have a couple of more questions. How do you think do you think it's useful that this kind of community building or capacity building is done under the kind of framework or the lens of CVE versus another aspect, you know, because that's something that has been questioned or criticized, that things that government in terms of community capacity building should be doing anyway, and why should it be done through the CVE framework?
Excellent question. And the answer is, it's not necessarily the case that it should, right? What I'm trying to say is, if you really want to get ahead of the problem, strategic counterterrorism ultimately is about good governance, healthy communities, right? So you're right, those are things we should be doing anyway. And we should be doing them not because we're trying to prevent some threat, but because that's what we do. It may be the case that doing that, you know, enables, you know, it makes people better citizens and participatory, you know, and therefore mitigates potential, but not everything should be done that way. I completely agree. But this gets back to that kind of Venn diagram conversation that I was talking about earlier with CT and Great Power Competition. Here too, we need to get, you know, Health and Human Services and Department of Education and the security side of things into the room, figure out, so I know, you know, here's what we're trying to do, here's what you're trying to do, where do those things mesh, right? We've had situations here in the United States where one department had money that it was running out of, end of the year, funds that had to be spent, but they didn't want to kind of talk to other people, so they didn't, and it's not like they had, oh, here's where it should be spent, we know where it should be spent. So it would have been great if they'd convened an interagency meeting and say, look, we've got, you know, X amount of money to spend. We don't have a specific thing in mind. What can we do with this, right? Under the CVE task force model, it was very, very difficult, ultimately failed to get Health and Human Services, Department of Education, and a couple of others into the room because they didn't want to be seen as being securitized. Well, HHS already has a public safety, public health function to it. I think we need to push back on this a little bit. Not everything CVE is bad. Not everything CVE is spying on communities. There's a little bit of haters gonna hate going on here. but we also have to recognize that when we come to a community and we haven't come to them before and said, hey, we want to help you with X, Y, and Z good governance issue. We've never done that before. Now we finally do, only because we're afraid that you and your kids might be threats to the rest of us. That doesn't sit well. And I wonder how things are going to transpire now that the most pressing terrorist threat in the United States is domestic, and it isn't primarily people with darker skin who immigrated to this country recently. It's people with white skin who don't like to admit it, but immigrated to this country also, maybe a little while longer ago, right? So these community engagements that we've done, going out to, say a Muslim American community somewhere, even the ones that have been done really, really well, right? I don't see government jumping to do that, in a community that is seeing a rash of neo-Nazi, white supremacists, anti-authority and anti-government, incel, whatever threats going. I don't see it, and we're gonna have to bridge that gap, right? Because either we're going to do these or we're not going to do these, but we're not going to do it in some circumstances and not in others. So ultimately, yeah, we need to take a step back and recognize that if one of the big problems is there's pockets of lack of good governance, then send the people who do that in and stand back. Continue to do your whatever you do, keep your finger on the pulse to make sure there's no threats coming from there, that the threats are getting worse or that the threats are getting less, but let the people who do the positive side of government do their thing, and then maybe come back and have your quarterly assessments, however you want to do that. Not everything needs to be done through a securitized counterterrorism or CVE framework or rubric.
So we have a question about the language of it all, or the terminology around countering violent extremism. You say you don't have a problem kind of using that term, but others have avoided using it. So can you talk about the utility of the terms and the language around countering violent extremism?
Yeah. Look, part of this is just I'm older than I look. And I've been around several renamings. Here in the United States, the last renaming was away from CVE and towards terrorism prevention. Under the Trump administration, the idea was, well, we're just going to call a spade a spade. To my mind, then you're calling everything that you're dealing with here terrorism, and not all of it is. There's a difference between extremism and terrorism. There are extremist ideas that are perfectly protected. To me, it's just we can get lost in the semantics. At the end of the day, the idea of countering, not combating, or countering violent extremism. So we're not going against all extremism. We're not taking on anybody who in any way is different, i.e. radical, right? To me, that makes a lot of sense. I think the problem with the term isn't the term. It's just that it's the term that was being used when people took issue with many of the things that were put under that rubric. Some of them are things that legitimately deserve to be taken issue with, and others really not so much. So, call it peanut butter. Someone's going to have issue with the term peanut butter. It depends on what we actually do under these programs. Now, lots and lots of places are just saying, listen, the reality is lots of people, including people we need and want to partner with, are very uncomfortable with the term. To which I say, fine, don't use it. I'm not saying like this is the only term for it, but when I've been running this CVE working group for 5 years now, and I said, look, I'm not going to change the name just because the U.S. government is now calling it terrorism prevention. This to me is what it is. But when someone says to me, look, that's fine, but I'm not using that term when I go out and I work with these NGOs or whatever, because ultimately it is offensive to them, and I recognize that whether it should be or shouldn't be, then fine. Use the terminology that works. It doesn't all have to be securitized. Right? By the way, I'm happy to talk to the CVE side of this all day, but I do want to stress that that's not the big idea here. The biggest idea is on the U.S. posture abroad.
Mhm.
And I think it's important to note that when it comes to the CVE issue, actually, we've been pretty forward leaning in terms of helping others through the State Department's counterterrorism branch in ways even that we haven't been so effective here at home.
Mm.
It's been a real kind of glaring delta. And there are some legal and other issues, but you know, we need to be kind of upping our CVE or terrorism prevention or stopping people from wanting to kill other civilians, you know, whatever you want to call it, uh, efforts at home in ways that are parallel to the way we've been promoting it appropriately, I believe, abroad.
So to that point, we actually have a question around that CT capacity building with partners. And the question is around perhaps the lack of cultural competency in parts of the US government and the military. So you find that the question is around, you know, when the United States is attempting to build CT capacity in other places, there could be issues around not understanding or aligning the other national objectives or perhaps different worldviews of those that we're working with, you know, whether it be France, for example, you know, an allied partner, or Pakistan, which is not necessarily allied, but someone that we have partnered with in counterterrorism capacity. So could you speak to that, that kind of question or issue around different understandings between partners, different worldviews, and also different objectives when it comes to not just counterterrorism, you know, just national competition and competing national security objectives of partner governments?
So I'm going to leave the competition part, the pure competition, out. I think the most important part of the question, I think what was really intended with the question is, um, when we're trying to partner, some of the cultural issues and how we go about doing things. I think there's a really important point here. At one point in the study, I argue that, you know, we just need to do a little more listening. I have a little bit of a unique perspective here because I'm an academic now. I've been in government. I've been the participant in and the head of delegation on, you know, meetings with allies lots of different times. And I would think back, I think probably, you know, my criticism applies no less to myself. I think sometimes we come in to a meeting, we know what we want, we know what we're trying to achieve, we know what we're trying to get out of said partner, and we do a lot of talking. And at one point in the paper, I argue that we need to do a little bit more listening. We need to, if you really want to enhance your credibility and your reliability as a partner, you got to be able to walk in and try and understand how others see the problem set. Now, sometimes what you're going to find is that there's tremendous common understanding, and that's great. Other times there won't be, but that'll help you understand what the issues are, how to reformulate your ask, whether the ask is even worth it, and how to go about the issues. Look, I think one area that is a really good example, you can see over my shoulder, I wrote a book on Lebanese Hezbollah, has been US-European conversations over what to do about Lebanese Hezbollah, Shia militant group tied to Iran, not Al-Qaeda, not ISIS, sometimes even fighting ISIS. And these conversations that have been had have actually been really effective, not only in terms of helping one another understand, but also getting stuff done. There are European countries that if you walked into the room and said, look, you got some Hezbollah guys doing some nasty stuff in Southern Europe, it wasn't going to go anywhere. But if you walked in and said, listen, you've got some Lebanese criminals who are moving drugs in into Southern Europe, selling that drug in Europe and using that to fund militancy, then they didn't care which Lebanese militia it was, and it didn't bother. Then they weren't not going to do it if it was Hezbollah. They'd cooperate. And now, if you look at Europe, you know, designating Hezbollah in its entirety at the EU level is still going to be, I think, a very hard push. They've designated just the military wing. But if you look at several European countries, there's been tremendous progress, including some countries that just don't have domestic terrorism lists, and they found other ways to to deal with this problem set. So I do think that there is a real issue in terms of having a better understanding of how partners and allies see the problems that we're looking at. I think it's less of an issue, frankly, with the partners we know really, really well, which is why this submarine deal issue with and the fallout with France is such a big deal. There's fallout from between France and the US, France and the UK, France and Australia. That's a pretty big deal, deserved or not, whatever. I'm not a submarine expert. I'm just that, but also something like Pakistan, a country that is sometimes more of a contributor to instability than not, and that is sometimes very close to actors that we have real issues with. Still, we got to understand what they're all about. I think, by the way, if you take it down even more granularly to the military, that's a different problem set. But I think there's already tremendous literature on the fact that we have had people who understood, tribal realities and who people were, etc., but not enough of them. And even just since the withdrawal in Afghanistan, I think it was over the weekend in the New Yorker, there was a very, very powerful piece that demonstrated that, when the U.S. forces came into Afghanistan, some of the very first people that we partnered with were some really, really, really nasty warlords who, and that significantly undermined the way we were perceived before bombs and bullets started flying everywhere, even from the very first day. So this issue of cultural competency is a very important one.
That's a really important point about listening, to partners in this effort. There's a follow-up question. It was asked within the context of CVE, but I think it also can be asked broader with counterterrorism. In addition to kind of the listening bit of it, how much do you think the US has learned from successes and failures of other countries? And how much has it paid attention to that? Or is the US just kind of churning on its own in terms of developing its own policies, perhaps reinventing the wheel or not sufficiently paying attention to what works and what doesn't in similar jurisdictions, say like Australia or the UK?
So here I think we've gotten actually much, much, much better. And kind of 10 years ago, this was a huge, huge problem. And I can't tell you how many times I'd meet with people, and I've come down to Australia and New Zealand many times, but whether it was there or in Europe or elsewhere, and people would say to me, listen, we come to the United States all the time, and basically it's an experience where we're told by our American counterparts how well they know what they're doing. I think that there's been a real change there, and especially on issues like CVE. And the reason I say especially is because, look, the political environment here in the United States is unique in some ways, and there really isn't a culture of experimentation. So the reality is that many, many partners beyond our borders were experimenting in all kinds of things, a whole lot of which didn't work out so well, right? And people are very, very critical of the UK Prevent program, Contest, and the Prevent portion of it. Certainly on its earlier iterations, some people still today in its current iteration. You know what I say? I say wherever you are on that spectrum, kudos to the Brits. There's something to be said for trying and failing, but at least having tried, that you can't always say here in the United States. And so I think there's been a tremendous movement towards learning from others, because there's been so much experimentation elsewhere. I'm not saying that everything is perfect the way it should be, and we're all learning from each other, in a smooth and orderly fashion. But I do think that certainly on the CVE front, a lot of things have changed in terms of learning. Implementation will always be another issue, because ultimately that will be a factor of norms, practices, laws, and politics in whatever country, including here in the United States.
Well, we have time for, I think, a couple of more questions. So I might turn it a bit to kind of a more pointy end question. And going back to Afghanistan, a lot of governments and a lot of countries perhaps that the US might seek to partner with or not, don't list the Taliban as a terrorist organization, or even those that do. So how now that they're kind of have taken over power, not necessarily legitimized or recognized, how are we going to deal with the legalities of dealing with the Afghan state under the Taliban?
With difficulty. I don't mean to be flippant about it, but this is just, it's an excellent question. It's far too complicated a question to answer
Yeah.
simply. The Taliban is listed on some things. It's not listed on other things. It's not exactly a terrorism listing for most things. Even for those who, in those places where the Taliban are listed as a terrorist organization, there is a lot of soul searching 20 years on, certainly here in the United States, and I imagine elsewhere too. Like, what exactly? Why did we go into Afghanistan? Right, it was to crush Al Qaeda, but then the Taliban wouldn't give us Bin Laden, and so it became Taliban 2, and you couldn't destroy the Taliban without starting in state building, which we didn't want to do. But Steve Hadley, who was the national security advisor under Bush, said, "Look, we didn't want to do it, but there's no way to remove the Taliban without doing it." And in the end, some $1 trillion later, Taliban's back in power. A lot of countries also are saying, "Look, say what you will, but they're in power now. So de facto, we have to have some type of way to have conversations with them." All well and good, right? Look, the U.S. has a tremendous amount of diplomacy and funding and influence in Lebanon, despite the fact that we've designated Hezbollah for many, many years. On the one hand, a designation doesn't have to preclude some type of contact. Under most types of designations, it specifically does not preclude political contact. I can't tell you how many times I've been to Europe on issues related to designations, and they've said to me, for example, on Hezbollah, "Well, Matt, we can't designate Hezbollah because then we wouldn't be able to meet with a whole bunch of Lebanese politicians." And it got to the point where I would carry a copy of CP 931, Common Position 931, which is the European Union's designation authority, in my jacket pocket. I just pull it out and say, "Well, actually, here's what your designation authority actually says. So you could designate Hezbollah today and meet with Hassan Nasrallah tomorrow. Might not make for good headlines, but you could." I think that if the issue with the Taliban continues to be a security issue, if the issue with the Taliban continues to be a terrorism issue, I just don't see anybody not doing what has to be done. But what are we going to be doing about women's rights? I think there are just a tremendous number of questions that are not answerable in the moment. I do think that from a US sanctions policy perspective, it's going to be difficult to just kind of open the spigots. And that's going to have a real impact on the Taliban, given foreign reserves at the US Federal Reserve, et cetera.
So if we broaden it out, but keep it to Afghanistan, you talked about in your presentation the Venn diagram between CT and great power competition. How do you think Afghanistan fits into that Venn diagram?
Oh, in lots of different ways. I mean, first of all, in a really negative way, in that whether you were for the withdrawal or against the withdrawal, whether you think that my position that we should have kept some small forces there or not, is irrelevant. The how it was done, the implementation of the withdrawal, is a tremendous problem in many, many, many different ways, not least of which is the US credibility as a partner, and and our efforts now to revitalize alliances after the 4 years of the Trump administration, when so many of our allies were caught off guard, and therefore frantically trying to get their people out and their translators out. It was a very, very, very poorly done operation. And you'll hear people saying, "Yeah, but look at the number of people we got out, such a small number of times." So to which I say, yes, You shot yourself in the foot, but then you bandaged it really well. I mean, there's no question the people on the ground did amazing things under horrific circumstances, but we self-inflicted wound. The larger issue is that Afghanistan is at a crossroads. So I get asked about China a lot. And I think that China actually has some very, very mixed feelings about the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. China does not mind the US having significant egg on its face, which the US has on its face right now. But China was very, very happy to have the United States spend money and spill blood to keep the lid on the boiling kettle that was Afghanistan without China having to do it. And the East Turkmenistan Islamic Movement, ETIM or TIM, whichever way, it's the same thing, and the Uzbeks, etc. These were groups that could present some very significant threats to China. There's no one there keeping tabs on them anymore. We're not spending the money. China doesn't typically spend money, right? They'll lend you money so that you can give them business. And I think China has some big, big concerns about the security situation in Afghanistan. They are much, much closer than either you or I are. So there's lots of different ways in which this can directly or indirectly affect great power competition. One of them is that, again, whether you agreed with the decision or not, it does free up forces. It does free up machinery, personnel for other things, in particular China, but Russia also.
Well, Dr. Matt Levitt, thank you so much for this wide-ranging and comprehensive discussion and presentation. It really speaks so highly to your expertise and experience on this. We've talked about things from the pointy end of counterterrorism operations to countering violent extremism to the intersection with great power competition. And I want to sincerely thank you for being with us here for this AVERT webinar, and also giving us that really broad and integrated perspective on how counterterrorism and countering violent extremism fits into alliance relationships, national security priorities of both the United States and its allies and its partners. So thank you so much. Apologies to everyone who didn't get their questions answered, but thank you very much to everyone who tuned in today and engaged with us and Dr. Levitt in this conversation. We'll be sure to put this on our website so you can refer back to it. We'll be sending links around, and also please stay tuned for other AVERT webinar announcements, and additionally more announcements around our Countering Violent Extremism Symposium, of which the call for papers is now circulating. So we hope to have as many of you involved and participating in that as well. Matt, thank you so, so much, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
Bye-bye now. Thank you.